50 years ago, the world watched in stunned silence as helicopters lifted off the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Below, thousands of South Vietnamese citizens, soldiers, families, children pleaded for a final escape as the North Vietnamese army closed in. It was the chaotic, tragic conclusion of a war that had defined a generation, reshaped geopolitics, and tested the limits of American resolve. Endgame, 50 years since the fall of Saigon, is a sobering journey through the final days of the Vietnam War, exploring not just how it ended, but why it mattered, then and now. In the years following World War II, a new kind of struggle emerged not between empires over land, but between ideologies over influence. Capitalism and communism began a worldwide rivalry that would come to define the second half of the 20th century. Caught in the middle was a small Southeast Asian nation that would become the battleground for a Cold War turned hot, Vietnam. For centuries, Vietnam had fought for its independence, first under Chinese imperial rule, then against French colonial control. By the mid-20th century, it was divided between the communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, supported by the West. What began as a civil conflict soon attracted international attention and intervention. The United States, determined to contain communism under its domino theory, committed itself to the defense of South Vietnam. If Vietnam fell, the fear was, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. At first, American involvement was limited, advisors, intelligence, funding, but as the South Vietnamese army faltered, Washington escalated. By the late 1960s, over 500,000 American troops were deployed to Vietnam. The war was brutal, disorienting, and unfamiliar. Dense jungles, guerrilla tactics, and a population difficult to distinguish from combatants turned the conflict into a nightmare. U.S. soldiers faced not only a determined North Vietnamese army, but also the elusive Viet Cong, communist guerrillas embedded within the South's civilian population. Meanwhile, back in the United States, a very different war was being fought. Television brought the horrors of Vietnam into American living rooms. Graphic footage of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and civilian casualties challenged the government's narrative of progress. The My Lai massacre, the Tet Offensive, and the Pentagon Papers all eroded public trust. Protests erupted across college campuses and city streets. The country was torn between hawks demanding victory and doves calling for peace. By the time Richard Nixon took office in 1969, the tide had turned. Nixon's plan, dubbed Vietnamization, aimed to shift the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese while gradually withdrawing American forces. In parallel, secret bombing campaigns were launched in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, expanding the war's scope and further destabilizing the region. Peace talks began in Paris, but dragged on for years. Each side hoped to strengthen its position on the battlefield before making concessions at the negotiating table. In 1973, the United States finally signed the Paris Peace Accords, officially ending direct U.S. military involvement. American POW were returned, and a ceasefire was declared, but the war was far from over. The North Vietnamese had no intention of accepting a permanent division, and the South lacked the strength to hold out alone. Despite promises of continued support, U.S. aid to South Vietnam declined rapidly in the following years, constrained by a Congress and public exhausted by war. South Vietnam's internal issues only worsened the situation. Corruption, low morale, and political instability plagued the government in Saigon. While the U.S. had spent years and billions of dollars trying to train and equip the Army of the Republic of Vietnam ARVN, its leadership remained weak and fractured. Soldiers deserted in droves. Many lacked faith in their commanders or the cause itself. As American forces withdrew, so too did the logistical support, air power, and artillery that had once bolstered South Vietnamese defenses. At the same time, North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, continued to rebuild and rearm. Hanoi saw opportunity, without U.S. troops on the ground, and with American political will nearly depleted, the North prepared to strike again. By late 1974, the stage was set. North Vietnam believed it could win, not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of public opinion. All it needed was one final push, one rapid and decisive offensive, to bring the war to a close. The Vietnam War had become more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of narratives, of identities, of worldviews. For America, it was a war fought not only in the rice paddies and jungles of Indochina, but in the hearts and minds of its own citizens. What began as a distant, strategic conflict had grown into a national trauma. And now, without American boots on the ground, the outcome rested squarely on the shoulders of a fractured South Vietnam and an emboldened North, ready to strike the final blow. The new year of 1975 arrived with an air of quiet desperation in South Vietnam. The United States had withdrawn its troops nearly 2 years earlier, and while military aid and advisors remained, the sense of abandonment was palpable. President Nguyen Van Thieu's government, facing declining morale, deepening corruption, and logistical shortcomings, struggled to hold together a military that was increasingly stretched thin. Meanwhile, in the North, Hanoi's leadership sensed the moment was right. The American public had little appetite for another intervention, and Congress had begun slashing aid to Saigon. The North Vietnamese believed they could win not in another drawn-out campaign, but in one swift and calculated strike that would cripple the South and bring the war to an end. The campaign they planned was bold, a large-scale, multi-pronged offensive designed to break ARVN resistance and capture key territories rapidly. This wasn't merely about reclaiming disputed zones. It was about toppling the South Vietnamese regime altogether. In March 1975, the first blow came in the Central Highlands with the assault on Ban Me Thuot. The city, strategically vital, fell quicker than expected. But it wasn't just the fall of Ban Me Thuot that signaled the unraveling. It was the reaction that followed. President Thieu ordered a tactical withdrawal from the Highlands, hoping to consolidate forces for a defense of the more populous coastal and southern regions. But what was intended to be orderly soon turned into chaos. Lacking coordination and leadership, ARVN units collapsed under the pressure of retreat. Entire divisions disbanded. Civilians, fearing massacres, joined the roads in massive numbers, hundreds of thousands of people clogging narrow highways in search of safety. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned posts, equipment was left behind, and entire provinces were simply handed over without a fight. The North Vietnamese capitalized on every misstep. With each town they captured, they found less resistance and more momentum. Hue fell, followed by Da Nang, South Vietnam's second largest city. What should have been a stronghold turned into another disastrous retreat. On the beaches of Da Nang, thousands of terrified civilians and fleeing soldiers tried to board boats, airplanes, anything that would take them away. North Vietnamese artillery rained down as American-trained ARVN troops, once considered elite, stripped off their uniforms to blend in with the fleeing masses. By April, the collapse was undeniable. The ARVN was no longer functioning as a coherent military force. It had become a patchwork of isolated units trying to defend against an oncoming tide. The North Vietnamese, led by General Van Tien Dung, saw that the door to Saigon was wide open. What was originally planned as a 2-year campaign now looked like it could conclude in weeks. The psychological blow of losing so many cities so quickly had broken the South Vietnamese spirit. Internationally, pleas from Saigon for renewed U.S. support went unanswered. President Gerald Ford, though sympathetic, could not convince Congress to re-engage. The American people had little interest in reigniting a war that had already claimed so many lives and shattered public confidence. Helicopter images from Saigon reminded them not of victory, but of failure. On April 3rd, Ford addressed the nation, requesting emergency aid for South Vietnam, but it was too late. The political will was gone. By mid-April, Saigon stood increasingly isolated. North Vietnamese forces had bypassed many defensive lines and were now encircling the capital. The air was thick with tension. The South Vietnamese government began preparing for a siege. Foreign diplomats, American personnel, journalists, and Vietnamese citizens with U.S. ties all knew what was coming. Rumors of mass executions, reprisals, and an iron curtain falling across the South spread rapidly. Operation Frequent Wind, the final American evacuation plan, was quietly put into motion. Preparations began to move civilians and key personnel out by helicopter. Yet for every seat on an aircraft, hundreds were left behind. As the North advanced, time was running out. What had begun as a war of slow escalation had reached its final, frantic climax. And all of it was now converging on one place, Saigon, the heart of a fading dream, and the last stand of a nation on the brink of vanishing. As April 1975 wore on, Saigon transformed into a city suspended between fear and disbelief. Once bustling with commerce and ambition, the South Vietnamese capital now echoed with the sound of nervous whispers, packed suitcases, and military broadcasts warning of impending doom. Families burned personal records and photographs, desperately trying to erase any trace of connection to the Americans. Those with ties to the U.S., translators, contractors, political allies understood what was coming and what might happen if they were left behind. The streets, once vibrant with motorbikes and street vendors, now pulsed with quiet dread. Tanks had not yet reached the city, but everyone could feel them coming. The sound of artillery grew louder in the distance with each passing day. Refugees poured in from the north, crowding Saigon's train stations and public parks, bringing with them tales of collapsed defenses, abandoned soldiers, and the red flags now flying over once secure cities. Inside the U.S. Embassy, panic management had become the daily routine. American officials scrambled to identify and prioritize evacuees' citizens, diplomatic staff, and eligible Vietnamese allies. Helicopter pads were cleared and rooftop landings were tested. Behind closed doors, orders were issued for the destruction of sensitive materials. Thousands of documents were shredded or burned in oil drums. Computers were smashed, communications gear dismantled. The embassy became a fortress not of defense, but of disappearance. On April 29, the final phase of the evacuation began. Codenamed Operation Frequent Wind, it was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. The streets were no longer safe. North Vietnamese artillery had begun shelling Tan Son En Hat Airport, rendering fixed-wing flights impossible. That left only helicopters. They came in waves from offshore aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy hovering over rooftops and embassy compounds, loading dozens at a time, lifting off into the smoky skies. Outside the embassy gates, a growing crowd of South Vietnamese civilians gathered in desperation. Some carried infants, others clutched photographs and identity documents. Most carried only the hope that they might be saved. The gates remained closed, guarded by U.S. Marines. Tear gas was fired occasionally to control the crowd, but the real barrier was the list. Only those who had been cleared could board. For many, pleading turned into panic, and still the helicopters came and went, engines screaming against the tension in the air. On the rooftop of the embassy, the scene became iconic, an image etched into the collective memory of the 20th century. Civilians clambered up a narrow staircase toward a waiting chopper. An American crewman reached down to help one more aboard, even as others were pulled back by security. Time was the enemy now. Every hour brought the North Vietnamese closer. The mission was to get as many out as possible before the final moment, when not even one more helicopter could return. That final moment arrived just after dawn on April 30. The last helicopter, tail number 5, 101 lifted off from the rooftop at 7:53 a.m., carrying the last U.S. Marines out of Saigon. Below them, the city was still filled with those left behind, tens of thousands of loyalists, friends of America, former military officers and officials who would now face the wrath of the incoming regime. The embassy gates were breached within hours. Staff who remained behind to destroy classified material were captured. It was over. By mid-morning, North Vietnamese tanks began rolling into the city. One drove straight through the wrought iron gates of the presidential palace. Inside, the South Vietnamese President Duong Van Minh, who had only taken office 2 days earlier, awaited the inevitable. In a brief and solemn radio broadcast, he told his people he was handing over power peacefully. At 11:30 a.m., he surrendered unconditionally to Colonel Bui Tin of the North Vietnamese Army. The flag of South Vietnam, yellow with 3 red stripes, was lowered for the last time. In its place, the red banner of the North rose above the capital. Crowds stood in stunned silence. Some cheered, others wept, and many simply watched, unable to believe that the long war, filled with so many promises and sacrifices, had ended in such finality. No more illusions, no more airlifts, no more help was coming. Saigon had fallen. The moment marked more than a military defeat. It was the symbolic collapse of America's most ambitious Cold War intervention, an end not just to a war, but to a vision of how the U.S. could shape the world. In the ruins of embassies and the dust of shattered streets, a generation came to terms with the limits of power and the cost of misunderstanding a people, a place, and a conflict too complex. Control. In the hours and days that followed the fall of Saigon, South Vietnam ceased to exist. The country that had for decades stood as a Western-backed bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia simply vanished. The red flag of the North now flew over government buildings, army bases, schools, and homes. Streets were renamed, statues torn down, maps redrawn, and for millions of South Vietnamese citizens, a terrifying new chapter had begun. North Vietnam's victory brought with it a swift campaign of control and punishment. Communist authorities wasted no time consolidating their power. Former officers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, civil servants, journalists, teachers, religious leaders, and anyone suspected of aiding the Americans were summoned to report to local offices. Many were told they would undergo brief re-education to prepare for life under the new government. In reality, these re-education camps became prisons, often remote, guarded, and brutal. Thousands were taken to the countryside, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. There, they endured forced labor, starvation, ideological indoctrination, and inhumane treatment. Families left behind were marked, denied rations, jobs, or schooling. The new regime aimed not just to punish, but to erase the Old South. Entire generations were to be reshaped under communist doctrine. At the same time, the Vietnamese people faced a deteriorating economy. The war had devastated infrastructure, agriculture, and industry. The reunification of the country did not bring the peace or prosperity many had hoped for. In the South, private businesses were seized, property redistributed, and currency devalued. What had once been one of the most westernized cities in Asia, Saigon, now officially renamed Ho Chi Minh City, plunged into poverty. Black markets flourished, food was scarce, life became a daily struggle. For millions, staying was no longer an option. So began one of the most desperate and heartbreaking refugee crises of the modern era. Between 1975 and the early 1990s, more than 2 million Vietnamese risked their lives to flee the country. They left by night, in silence, in overcrowded fishing boats, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of what once was. These were the boat people, men, women, and children who sailed into the unknown, hoping for rescue, for sanctuary, for freedom. Their journeys were often nightmarish. Some drifted for days or weeks without food or water. Others were ravaged by storms, attacked by pirates, or turned away at foreign ports. Many never made it, bodies washed ashore on distant beaches, entire boats vanished at sea, but still they fled because what awaited them at home was worse than the risk of the ocean. For those who survived, refugee camps in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines became temporary homes. And from there, many were resettled across the globe in the United States, Canada, France, Australia, and beyond. In America, the fall of Saigon triggered a mix of emotions: shame, grief, relief, and guilt. For years, the Vietnam War had dominated headlines, politics, and family dinner tables. Over 58,000 American service members had died. Tens of thousands more returned home wounded, both physically and psychologically. And many came back to a country that didn't honor their service. Veterans were not welcomed with parades or medals, but with protests, silence, or even scorn. The Vietnam War became a national wound, one that festered in the collective memory. Questions about why it was fought, how it was fought, and what had been accomplished were left largely unanswered. For the American people, the fall of Saigon was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a long period of introspection and reckoning. The illusion of American invincibility had been shattered. The idea that democracy could be exported through force had been tested and failed. In the years that followed, American cinema, literature, and politics all grappled with Vietnam. Films like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and The Deer Hunter gave audiences a visceral look at the horrors of war. Memoirs from veterans and refugees began to appear. Political leaders, wary of another Vietnam, adopted a more cautious approach to foreign interventions, a phenomenon later referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome. For the Vietnamese diaspora, the trauma ran deep. Families were separated, generations grew up in exile, yet even amid that loss, many rebuilt. In places like Orange County, California, and Houston, Texas, vibrant Vietnamese communities took root. Temples, restaurants, newspapers, and cultural festivals helped preserve identity and memory. These communities never forgot what was left behind or how it was lost. In Vietnam, the government celebrated reunification as a national triumph, but beneath the official history, millions lived with quiet grief for lost loved ones, lost homes, and lost futures. The cost of liberation had been steep, and for many, the scars never healed. Half a century after the fall of Saigon, Vietnam is a country transformed. The jungle battlefields and burn, doubt bunkers that once symbolized endless conflict have given way to highways, high-rises, and commerce. The city that once served as the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, is now officially Ho Chi Minh City, named after the revolutionary leader who led the communist North to victory. Its streets are filled with motorbikes, neon lights, and foreign tourists, but beneath the modern surface, the memory of 1975 still lingers, both in Vietnam and across the world. For many Vietnamese people, the war is not spoken of openly. It is remembered quietly, with reverence or sorrow, depending on which side one's family stood. Officially, the victory is commemorated each year on April 30 as Reunification Day, a national holiday celebrating the end of colonialism and the dawn of a unified socialist Vietnam. Government-organized parades, speeches, and patriotic songs fill the air. But for many others, especially in the South, that date is remembered very differently, as Black April, the day everything changed and everything was lost. The divide between the state narrative and personal memory reveals a complex truth. Reunification brought peace, but not unity. Economic hardship, political repression, and cultural suppression followed. It would take years, decades, even for Vietnam to begin healing from the deep wounds left by war. For much of the 1980s, the country remained poor, isolated, and dependent on Soviet support. But in 1986, a series of economic reforms known as D-stroke letter 1, ED, 5I, M letter 1, ED, EBI, ushered in a new era. The communist government began to open markets, attract foreign investment, and modernize its economy. The results were staggering. Today, Vietnam boasts one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. Skyscrapers rise over cities once cratered by bombs. Global brands operate in what was once enemy territory. A generation of young Vietnamese have grown up with no direct memory of the war, only stories told by their grandparents. They are more connected to the world than ever via smartphones, the internet, and global pop culture. To them, the past is distant, but for the older generations, for the exiles, and for the veterans, it never truly left. Among American Vietnam War veterans, the passage of time has brought reflection and, in some cases, reconciliation. Some have returned to Vietnam as tourists or as part of humanitarian missions, helping to clear landmines or build schools. They walk the streets of cities they once fought in, Da Nang, Hue, Pleiku, and find them unrecognizable. They speak with former enemies, now gray-haired and soft-spoken. The awkward handshakes and shared memories hint at a complex truth, that those who fight wars often carry the heaviest burdens long after the shooting stops. Others cannot return. The memories are too painful, the scars too deep. For many veterans, the war never really ended. It lives in flashbacks, in nightmares, in the silence of friends who never came home. For years, they battled not just the trauma of combat, but the indifference or hostility they faced upon returning home. It took decades for their service to be publicly honored, and even now, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., a long, black granite wall etched with over 58 zeros, zero names, stands not as a monument to glory, but to loss. The legacy of Vietnam shaped more than just those who fought there. It reshaped American foreign policy, military doctrine, and public trust. Politicians became wary of entanglements. The military restructured itself to avoid prolonged, unclear missions. And the phrase, "No more Vietnams," became a rallying cry for skeptics of future interventions. Yet even so, the echoes of Vietnam would return, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where once again, questions of occupation, withdrawal, and national identity would dominate the discourse. For the Vietnamese diaspora, those who fled, and those born in exile, the legacy is even more intimate. The Fall of Saigon was not a historical footnote, but the beginning of exile, of diaspora, of cultural displacement. Children of refugees grew up speaking two languages, carrying the weight of stories they never lived, expected to remember a homeland they had never seen. For them, April 30th remains sacred, not for what was won, but for what was mourned. And so, 50 years after the last helicopter left the roof of the U.S. Embassy, the Fall of Saigon remains a defining moment in the history of both nations. It marked the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. It revealed the limits of power and the complexity of identity. It taught that wars do not end with treaties or tank parades, but with memory, with consequence, and with time. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was loss. But for everyone, it was history, one that must never be forgotten. The Fall of Saigon was more than a military collapse. It was the end of an era of belief, ambition, and illusion. It left deep scars across continents, from the jungles of Vietnam to the suburbs of America. For some, it marked a long, awaited unification. For others, it was the beginning of exile and silence. Yet through pain and memory, resilience emerged, from refugee communities who rebuilt far from home, to veterans who found purpose in remembrance. 50 years on, the lessons of Vietnam still echo. That war is never simple, that power has limits, and that history, if forgotten, is destined to repeat itself.